Good Jobs First panel on opportunity zones. My name is Kasia Tarczyńska. I'm a research analyst with Good Jobs First. So Good Jobs First is a research and advocacy organization that promotes transparency and accountability in economic development business incentives across the country. And among other things we do every day is we provide assistance to journalists who want to write and investigate economic development subsidies. So a note to our participants today, we are recording this session so we can put it later on our YouTube channel. So today we have 4 great journalists with us to talk to us about Opportunity Zone. Eric Lipton with the New York Times, Lydia O'Neal with Bloomberg Tax, Jeff Ernsthausen with ProPublica, and Oscar Perry Abello with Next City. So just very quickly, Opportunity Zone program was created as a part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. It is a federal program that provides tax breaks to investors who want to put money into projects located in low-income areas that are designated as opportunity zones. There are about 8,800 of opportunity zones across the country, and the program has faced some criticism from the beginning. Among just to name a couple of issues with the program, there is no transparency or reporting provisions written into the program. There are no job requirements or wage standards requirements for OZ projects. Some opportunity zones areas are actually not low-income areas, but rather wealthier areas that are located next to low-income areas. And some of the opportunity zones have been going through gentrification even before the opportunity zones designation. So we'll have our great panelists today talking to us about how they did their investigation of opportunity zones. They will walk us through their process. They will talk to us about equity perspective, how journalists should talk about opportunity zones from equity perspective. They will tell us if opportunity zone is an equitable economic and community development tool or not. So we will have Eric speak first for about 10 minutes, and we'll have a few minutes, 10 minutes for questions and answers, and then we'll have Lydia, Jeff, and Oscar talk, and we'll have questions for the remaining 3 panelists after their presentations. So thank you so much, and Eric, please take it over.
Great. Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm just going to go to a graphic from Pew, which looks at the communities that have the highest share of middle-income adults in the United States, and sort of identifying that so many of them are in the Midwest. And the point that I wanted to start off with is that I think that the idea behind opportunity zones is a really smart one, and that the evidence is overwhelming that there has been a kind of a trend of a disinvestment in capital into middle-class communities, particularly in the Midwest, away from the coast, in most recent American history, and that those places are really starved for capital, and it's making it difficult for them to compete. And it means that it's having significant impacts on the middle class in the United States. And so the idea of taking, capital gains that are just sitting in people's accounts and applying them and reinvesting them in communities that are desperate for capital, and that perhaps traditionally, like a General Electric or a Ford, might be putting capital into those communities, but no longer is doing it, is a really smart idea. But I think that what we have found as reporters, and that other outside groups that have been looking in this have found themselves, is that the execution of this program has not necessarily matched up with the idea behind it in a way that really achieves its goals to the extent that I think that everyone had hoped it was going to. And I mean, one of the next points that I would make is just that the fact that there is so little data about where the opportunity zone capital is going in the United States I really am convinced that it's not an accident that we have so little data, that it was an intentional choice made by a very cynical one, to hide our ability to know where the money is going, and where this you know, these tax advantages are essentially, they cost every single American in money and tax dollars that are lost. It's just as the same. It's the equivalent of a federal grant to some extent. And the fact that we don't know where those monies are going is really unfortunate. But it's a reality that we're not, as reporters, are not going to get around. So, I mean, some of the best data sources that is simply to just look at the map of where opportunity zones are. Novogradac, you know, which is an accounting firm that has had a really good practice of tracking opportunity zones, has a good map. I mean, there's a federal government. You know, there's a number of federal government maps that you can just type in an address if you're a reporter any place around the United States, and you can find the opportunity zones in your community. So that's where you might get started if you want to do a story about opportunity zones. And then there's a couple of websites, this one, Opportunity DB, which are actually, you know, people are teaming up with them to promote available opportunity zone properties. And you know, there's 1,039 here. That's not that many given the number of opportunity zones, but this is, at least there are some places that are doing that, and this is one of them. This is more of a way to make money for Opportunity DB. But another thing you can do, I found, is if you go to Delaware, you know, every corporation's favorite home state, you can actually do a search under. If you simply do a search under OZ, under entity name, and you'll find a bunch of people are creating opportunity zone. Did I do it wrong? Well, entity name, I must have done the code wrong. But you'll find a bunch of them there just by doing, you can, you know, because they're, and also if you do a search in SEC records with OZ or Opportunity Zone, you'll find companies that are disclosing in SEC filings that they've created. So what you'll find here in Delaware, and you know, you can do the search yourself. If you just literally put entity name OZ, you'll get hundreds, if not, of different corporations that have been created. And you don't know that that corporation is an opportunity zone, but it's a hint that it might be. And you can then attempt to reverse engineer who it is behind that. And so if you do SEC searches and you do corporate searches, you will find, you know, evidence of opportunity zone funds that have been set up. But one of the things that we've all seen as reporters is that so many of the projects that have actually, you know, gotten off the ground are projects like this in Houston, which is an already fast-growing part of downtown Houston that really needed no stimulus, and that was already gentrifying. And why does a luxury apartment building like this need OZ capital? I mean, really, one of the craziest of all is the Ritz-Carlton in Portland, one of the largest undeveloped commercial lots in downtown Portland. And then here's you know, we wrote about it, and they were reluctant to confirm it when we wrote about it in a story that the Times did. But this is the prospectus for, you know, a prime opportunity and then they do a calculation of how much more money you can make towards the bottom here by using OZ than wherever it was. There was a calculus down here that's somewhere. By making it an OZ instead of just do a normal investment. I think, is this it here? OZ benefits, right. So you'll make this much more money as an investor because it's an opportunity zone, which is not, to me, this is not driving capital middle class communities. I'll stop in a minute. I mean, at the times Jesse Drucker and I did a look at how much of the money was going to real estate projects that were already planned. And others have done similar pieces. Bloomberg has done some really good work on it, obviously, and many other you know, publications. And I think the Urban Institute has been really helpful as a data source and good studies. you're talking, another place I went was you go to these OZ conferences. They were sort of a gold mine because there's all these OZ conferences around the United States before COVID. Now there aren't right now, but they're a place you can go to meet lots of people who are looking to raise capital or, get capital when those things get started again. So, I mean, lastly, I'd say that, obviously coronavirus has significantly slowed down real estate development and investments in opportunity zones. There's, I think, even greater impetus to push out the deadline beyond 2026 in which you can take advantage of this program. I suspect that Congress will probably do that because, there's been essentially a lost year here. So I'll stop talking now, and if you had some questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Eric. So if you have questions, please unmute yourself or you can type into the chat box. Any questions for Eric? So I do have actually, Eric, a question for you. So this is a very complicated program, yes? The rules are complicated, there's a lot of acronyms. So can you give us some tips? How do you write about this program so it's accessible and easy to understand for readers who, not everybody understands the financial lingo behind, capital gains and so on? How do you write about this program so it's easy to understand? I mean,
the advantage that this program offers is that it is all about, real places and real property. And it's all about, maps that show you the actual land where the stuff's supposed to happen, not only in terms of real estate projects, but also supposedly in business development, which hasn't really happened that much. So, I mean, while it's a complicated thing, it also is a topic that is inherently, set up in a way that anecdotally. And so you just have to pick your locations and tell the story through particular places. And that's the way to tell the story is through, communities, and where either it's a story of capital that's going in the projects that don't need it, or communities that have opportunity zones that have seen next to no investment. To me, that's sort of that's where I would start to shift the story right now. Is I would start to figure out where, let's find some, and, I'm not currently writing about this topic, but where, let's look at some of the most needy opportunity zone, census tracts in the United States and then speak with the local economic development people that have seen zero publicly identified capital flows so far, and then sort of reconstruct, well, why hasn't that happened? So again, that's the way to tell the story, is through real places and real people, and because these things are all mappable, I think that's the it's sort of it offers you the answer right there.
Great. So we have a question from in the chat box. How would you recommend reverse engineering a company so that you can find out who is behind it and where it is? Any sites you would like to go? Any sites you like to go get company information?
So if it's a fund, an OZ fund, they usually will have a prospectus of some kind, and you can often get that prospectus by contacting the fund itself or speaking with lawyers that advise the fund, or that, if they have a website, they might have information. Knowing who is actually putting their capital gains into that fund is very difficult unless they're going to voluntarily tell you, because they're not required to disclose that in a public way. But you can, just word of mouth is unfortunately the best way to figure that out. If you start with a piece of land and then find out if there's any publicly known opportunity zone investment, and then you find out who that fund is that's behind it, and then you attempt to find out who the investors are that are putting capital into that fund, it's just a matter of kind of reverse engineering it. But it's a fair amount of labor because there is no public disclosure. And again, that is not an accident. It was done on purpose, and it's really unfortunate and contrary to the public interest.
Any other questions for Eric? If not, thank you so much, Eric.
Great.
For your time.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. And Lydia, please take it over.
Okay. So I'm going to share my slide, I guess. One second. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to just run through a little update of what's happening on the Hill and the White House and IRS and Treasury. So there have been a lot of bills recently during the pandemic that kind of would try to use this as an answer to the economic crisis. Republicans tend to want to expand it or extend it somehow, and then Democrats were leaning toward reforming it. Like Gregory Meeks' bill to allow community development financial institutions to get OZ investments, since one criticism has been that there's not a lot of good overlap between CDFIs and opportunity funds, which has all Democratic co-sponsors. There's a bill from John Curtis that would make just all small businesses that are impacted by the pandemic eligible for opportunities on opportunity fund financing. And then there's Denver Riggleman's bill to delay the date when the tax would happen on the gains that are deferred to 2030 rather than 2026, just the current deferral timeline. And Dan Bishop's bill would direct the SBA to train these field representatives to just help people understand or help investors with their investments. And there have been a lot of bills, or dozens of bills over the past couple of years to that are just broader funding or infrastructure, broadband proposals. There's even an EB-5 visa program bill that make opportunity zones target areas. And there are a lot of Democrats who are introducing these as well. So I would say, don't expect this to go away anytime soon, because there really is a lot of bipartisan support, even though you might see Rashida Tlaib try to propose repealing it, but there really is a lot of bipartisan support. It just, people differ, or Democrats and Republicans generally differ with some exceptions on whether they want to just make it bigger or whether they want to make some major changes. And also it's worth noting that in terms of the targeting, there's been some criticism as to whether these are really the best areas to target, because only 25% of the eligible tracts were chosen, so that's another 75% of quote-unquote low-income tracts that did not make it. And of course, there are the tracts that have gotten a lot of attention in Portland and LA that are clearly not the conventional idea of low income. And at the White House, so the White House has been promoting these pretty aggressively. Sure you guys saw the Council of Economic Advisors report where they had this estimate of between $33 and $93 billion raised but not deployed by the end of 2019. They took a bunch of SEC registrations and the Novogradac accounting firm's rolling survey, and then just kind of proportioned that to some preliminary count of forms that Treasury had. So that got some criticism for, kind of pulling the numbers out of nowhere. And then the White House recently semi-recently, issued an executive order to direct federal agencies to choose or to prioritize opportunity zones when selecting places to locate federal agency offices, which again brings up the targeting issue, which maybe these are not the best places to prioritize for that kind of thing. And then the White House, Opportunity and Revitalization Council, or I might be messing that up. But there's opportunityzones.gov is this website where they just list all of their actions, and it's across so many agencies, and virtually every agency has some list of actions where they've targeted grants or some other program to this, which again, that targeting issue. And then also on that, it's important to keep that in mind when we finally do get data on this, because so many other parts of the federal government have turned their attention to this and diverted resources to these areas that it will kind of dilute, whether the policy works on its own. And then, so Tim Scott, the one of the original authors of the legislation, has said he is pushing the White House and Treasury to extend the deadline for investors to shave off that full 15% of tax on their gains, which the deadline was at the end of 2019, and he wants to push it 2 years. He used to want to push it 1 year because the regs took so long to come out. And then Trump, of course, keeps describing this sort of vague, unspecified expansion, which is in his agenda, and he mentioned it at the RNC. And then Scott and some other groups like the Economic Innovation Group successfully pushed Treasury to give them some deadline relief for the pandemic as well, or to give investors some deadline relief. And then Cory Booker, when he was running, and also at a recent conference, proposed some reforms, such as getting rid of the quote-unquote bad tracks and adding newer, poorer ones, providing assistance to localities so that they can get a little bit more involved, because a criticism of this has been that funds can kind of just do whatever they want and change neighborhoods and not really notify the local government of what they're doing. And then Booker, like Scott, also wants to pass reporting requirements. But Booker is not a co-sponsor of Scott's reporting requirements bill. That one only has, I think, Kristen Sinema is the only Democrat who's co-sponsoring it. So there's a lot of divide between on reporting requirements on how much to disclose publicly. So you have on one end of the spectrum, Ron Wyden has this big reform bill that he introduced in November, and that would have like a 990-esque disclosure of what investors are doing, versus Scott's Impact Act, which is a lot more anonymized. And then Biden has some similar reforms to what Booker has proposed or what his staffers have described. It's part of his Build Back Better plan, focused on like racial equity. One other thing I forgot to mention. Someone, I think it was Brett Theodos, brought up on a recent webcast that one sort of underrated thing that we should look out for in this election is who gets chosen as Treasury Secretary, because that Treasury has a lot of leeway in adding guardrails, or they could just put strict reporting requirements on there if they want, or they could put some kind of application in there for investors, or more requirements like that. So that's really going to be a big thing to watch. So at Treasury, so they released a form for investors last year, and then based on that form, which didn't really ask for much, it was like structure of the fund and track number and investment amount, and not really much beyond that. But Dan Kowalski, who is counsel to Mnuchin, but really like the Treasury point person on this, has said that they plan to release a heat map, which is what he called it, by next summer. And then Treasury, or IRS, isn't fully finished with guidance on this either. They're working on guidance for foreign investors and how they can get involved individually, which they already can through a blocker corporation or a partnership, but this is for foreign individuals with real estate gains in the US. And also the Treasury Acting Inspector General said that they're investigating this in January. And then, so I had a story earlier in September. I just kind of looked at the design of the policy and just sort of a big fact check on all these, all the rhetoric that's sort of painting it as the answer to our times. So I try not to focus on the anecdotes. I might differ with Eric a little bit on this, because I think because we don't have the data, we don't really know what is the rule and what is the exception, because there are affordable housing projects and there are areas that have done really well with this, but then again, there are, of course, the really bad examples. And so I tried to focus on just the design and how the rewards go to profits. They don't go to employment or wages paid. And so, what does that incentivize? A high return. And then the high return is needed for the 10-year hold, which is what yields the biggest benefit, which is kind of a challenge for impact investors. And then the zone selection, of course, I think everyone's familiar with. Lack of requirement of coordinating with the community. Low-income individuals are unlikely to have capital gains. And the fact that it doesn't work well with CDFIs, and there is some data to show that it's predominantly real estate from the firm Novogradac. Some source recommendations. Definitely would recommend going to regulations.gov and looking at comments on the, there are two sets of regulations. There's the proposed that was in October 2018 and then in April or May of 2019. And so I would look at those, who's written letters on those, and then there are hearings too. You can look at the hearing list and what people testified, which is still relevant. You can go to those people and say, hey, I saw you said this in 2018 or 2019. Do you feel like, has that changed at all? Do you feel more reassured or not? And then the Novogradac accounting firm, they have a list that I really like, because it's not just the names of funds, but it's also the location and what they're actually trying to invest in, and also their contact information, which is really, really helpful. So if you see one in your area, or you just want an anecdote or someone to talk to, they're right there. And then I've looked at the Senate lobbying database a lot. You just do specific issue area or specific lobbying issue, and just use different opportunity zone keywords. And I had found that a lot of cities were lobbying on this, so that actually prompted me to FOIA them, and then learn that there was kind of an effort across a bunch of cities to switch or add new zones. And then Edgar, sort of similar to the Delaware court, you can search for different funds that might have those keywords in the name. And then, yeah, Brett Theodos again is really great. There are lots of academics who are looking into this, like Becky Lester at Stanford. And then people on the ground, like city and state economic development officials, will be really great to tell you what's happening and what they can see happening, and what they can't see might tell you a lot too. And then minority and local chambers of commerce and business groups, like I talked to the former head of the Black Chamber of Commerce, who had a lot to say about it. And then, of course, the lawyers who advise the funds. They're kind of range in, obviously they have skin in the game, but they range between like total proponents, but some of them are also really cynical about it. So you can just get a range of viewpoints there, and also expertise. So yeah, I guess that's my slides. How do I? Oh, stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Lydia. We have a request from the chat box. If you could put some links to those resources you just showed us, if you could put the links to the chat box, if you don't mind, that would be great for everybody to see the links. Thank you so much, Lydia. So Jeff?
Am I next? Or Oscar? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Try to share my screen here. Right.
Shoot.
Okay. Can you guys see a browser? Just want to double check I didn't pull up the wrong screen. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of opportunity zones and our work on it, our work on this law, most of this was last year, and we focused on sort of investigating, in some ways, kind of again the opposite, maybe in some ways of what Lydia mentioned, but we were sort of like, let's look at the outliers And so the reason I'm starting with this map is because we got started on this, and the outliers being like places that sort of seem like extreme but are in the program. So places that were like very seemingly high, high income, et cetera. So I bring up this map because we all kind of got started on this when a colleague asked me, I'm a data reporter, he asked me to take a look at a spreadsheet, and we were looking at some of the high income sort of tracks that had fallen in there. And I live in Baltimore, and sort of out of curiosity, I wondered, like, is the local, multi-billion-dollar controversial development going to be an opportunity zone? So we took a look at this, and indeed it is. But the interesting thing is, like, if you look at the qualifications, we noticed it didn't seem to match the program in any way. I mean, it's so high income that it couldn't possibly be admissible based on its being a neighbor to lower income areas, and certainly couldn't get it on its own. But the Treasury had marked it as like a low income zone. So I stared at this map a lot, trying to figure out exactly what was going on here. There's some other provisions in the law that are worth knowing about in terms of making a place eligible that have to do with places that have low populations and maybe are part of older programs. So I was thinking, like, okay, so I guess it must be one of those. It must have gotten in one of those ways. And so next to it here is this other sort of qualifying area that is one of these like lesser known provisions of the law. And it turns out that this track that we became interested in ended up being admitted based on this tiny bit of overlap that the Treasury says it was enough to make it qualify as being within one of these old districts that ultimately like was a basis for its admission into the program. What became even more interesting is to find out that like this is essentially just noise in geographic data. That overlap is actually completely fictitious, and this highway here was always the boundary between these two areas. So we kind of got started looking into zones by taking all of the census data from across the country and essentially reverse engineering what the Treasury's analysis must have been in order for it to have allowed these zones into place. And from there, we sort of targeted our reporting based on that. We started looking at tracks like this one where you zoom out, you can see the local sort of billionaire who controls most of this, there's a local billionaire and he controls most of this tract, right? So this was kind of like the initial sort of pattern we started looking for. And so, based on the data, based on looking at things that didn't totally add up, we started to file FOIA requests. And I think these may be like sort of instructive or useful generally, but basically simultaneously to trying to nail down what in the hell happened here with the Treasury Department, we were sending requests out to the people who would have been making decisions about this in the area. So, and this pattern turned out to like hold relatively well, even though this is done in different places. But basically, this law gave a lot of discretion to the governor to make these decisions. Basically, all the power to the governor to make these decisions based on what tracks were in there. And naturally, that led to people trying to make sure that their voice was heard. And the people who would know to have their voice heard on this were more often going to be those who were interested in taking advantage of it for saving money on their capital gains or raising more money based on other people's capital gains. So what we found in terms of requests were pretty effective would be to, for this story, we then were able to find emails where showing that the governor's office was well aware that this was not qualified for the program, and they admitted it anyway. And finding those sort of entailed putting in FOIA requests to the Economic Development Agency in the area. And in there, we included requests for communication from the lobbyists for Kevin Plank's company, the local billionaire who runs Under Armour. So we requested communications between them and the chief of staff for the governor, or the governor, chief of staff at the community development organization, and the head of the community development organization. We put in similar requests at the city level. So knowing that there was a lot of coordination with the cities and the state, we put in requests with Baltimore City around this to figure out what their communications looked like. And then, of course, with this, we were able to put together a picture of how this happened, which, essentially, like, the city didn't request this tract. It ultimately came down to a meeting with the governor's office between the lobbyists on behalf of Kevin Plank and the governor's staff. And so that same model, in some sense, we were able to then apply in another case out in Michigan, where you had similarly, you had several tracts that were admitted to the program there, and there was one entity that stood out clearly as benefiting from that admission. And then in that case, it was Quicken Loans and Dan Gilbert's companies. So sort of following that same playbook, we went to the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, we went to the city and put in FOIAs with them, specifically looking for communications with those companies. And we're able to find that, the companies were, of course, in there trying to make sure their voices were heard, trying to make sure their areas were included, including at some point their own map of which places Detroit should include. So I highly recommend, if people are interested in getting into this in their area, that they sort of consider looking at those outliers. If you want to see the way that political influence was essential in this program, FOIA requests to the State Economic Development Agency, wherever you are, and to the governor's office. Often there will be some communication there regarding these. And then if there's a really specific sort of local area that you're interested in, and kind of the projects that you think may have been influential or involved in swaying decisions in that area, it can be useful to go to the city and or county and put in requests for communication related to that. Basically that's basically what we focused on in this. At the same time, I would say that, as far as data sources, I guess I would echo that there's not a lot of here's where the investments are now. I think there's still value in going back to the old census data or going to these maps. Cone Resnick was our go-to for seeing areas that were included or excluded in the program. I haven't looked at this in a while, but it's so the color scheme's a little more, I find, more difficult to use. But interestingly, you'll see that the census tract that is a qualified opportunity zone here was not actually colored in as eligible, which was another clue that was potentially problematic. But you can use these maps to see the underlying data in your area if you were interested in looking at places that were, in this instance, very high median income, low poverty rate, and kind of figuring out what's going on in those areas. But I recommend following up with FOIA requests and kind of figuring out how this played out.
Thank you so much, Jess. Next, Oscar.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Kasia and Greg. Thanks for bringing me on. And I know you guys asked me to talk about whether this is sort of qualified as equitable economic development. And I guess, for one thing, I should kind of define or provide some definitions of what that could mean. And I'll do that, but let me first just say that, to reiterate what everyone's demonstrated already that because of the lack of transparency in this program, it's really like a Rorschach test, and you don't even see the whole plot. Like, can you do cool things with it? Yeah, you know, probably it'll end up in some deals that'll probably sound pretty awesome at the end of the day. But yeah, those are the exceptions to the rule. Also, it's sort of I put projects that I write about on a spectrum of like, where is the project? Who is it benefiting? How is it held accountable if it's not benefiting? If it's not happening, you know, where does that power lie? But those are important questions that everyone likes to answer and journalists like to explore. But those are just the surface level for me. Like, I'm also, you know, we also have to ask who owns the project. You know, at the end of the day, where did the idea for the project come from? Like, did it come, you know, what was the process behind it? Obviously, you have examples like Port Covington where, you know, you had this local billionaire, you know, industry mogul who was like, I'm going to take this piece of land and I'm going to turn it into something else. And he's been trying to do that for years. And this thing kind of popped up at the end, at the sort of the tail end of his like planning process. And obviously he's going to jump on that. And there are also projects that have been community driven and community oriented that have been in the process for years. And you know what? Yeah, some of them are going to get a piece of this too. And that's why it's so hard to like answer the question, like, is this qualify as equitable economic development? I mean, if you want to like zoom out and talk about the whole system of like our country's financial and economic political system, I mean, it can be used for equitable economic development. But, you know, we've seen that most of the time it's not used for that. And a lot of what we do as journalists is to look into like how that happens. So let me talk about equitable economic development and just give you some of the things that I look for in a story. It starts with what I mentioned, like the idea for where it comes from. And a lot of times it happens with the developer. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. So, you know, I did a story, for instance, about a project in Atlanta where the developer grew up in the neighborhood. He went off and was in the music industry for a while, and he has childhood memories of this neighborhood. And he went off and kind of got to know how the investment world works, and he's never really been in real estate before. But because of his background and who we met out in Los Angeles and being in the entertainment industry and being around money, he just was able to figure out, you know, every wealthy person has a little bit of real estate in their portfolio. So his dad got sick, and so he started going back to Atlanta and looking around and trying to figure out, can I get a piece of this real estate game? And, you know, to some extent, there's equity here in that the person driving this project came from the neighborhood, grew up in the neighborhood. His parents still live there. His parents came to the community meeting where he unveiled his project to the neighborhood. Like, you know, and he did that last year, which is probably at this point years before the project, you know, ever breaks ground. And it's one of the few examples I could point to where, yes, opportunity zones had something to do with how this project started, because he would not have been able to get the investors lined up that he's been able to get so far without the tax break as a way to start the discussion. And some of those investors, by the way, they're not even using the tax break. You know, this is another thing about this project. If you know the way real estate works, there's an equity layer. You know, there's it's like your down payment. Then there's a mortgage layer, so that you're getting debt. You're borrowing money from somewhere else. It could be a bank. It could be a pension fund. It could be an insurance company. There's probably multiple debt layers. You know, there's like you'll hear words like senior debt, subordinate debt, and it's basically just, you know, who gets paid off first if this project goes wrong. Those other investors on the debt side, you know, they may be public investors. They may be a city or a state, a housing finance agency or an economic development authority that's coming in. You know, when it comes to like investing in economic development in underserved areas, like you know, this part of Atlanta has been disinvested for a while. I mean, it's being gentrified now, but that is, you know, the state or the city government is often going to be involved somehow. So, in addition to the tax break, to the equity side of the deal, the developers, the investors who are providing equity, because remember, opportunity zone investments are equity investments. There might be some subsidized loans in here as well, and a lot of folks are also talking about how you know, if the loan is coming from a bank and it's in a low to moderate income area, the bank can also get Community Reinvestment Act credit for it. And in May, the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, they're one of the major bank regulators in the US. They regulate all of the big banks. It's funny, there's about 5,000 banks in the country, and the OCC only regulates around or less than 200 of them, but they regulate the biggest of them. You know, they regulate 70% of banking assets in the country. Anyway, the OCC changed its rules to how it enforces the Community Reinvestment Act, which is supposed to be an act that's supposed to encourage banks to invest in lower to moderate income communities. And they sort of clarified, and they're sort of celebrating. This is a statement from the OCC talking about how, you know, they're excited that there's going to be more OZ and CRA overlap. So again, OZ, these are the investors who they're the developer or the developer's partners on a deal, private equity funds, family offices. Everyone who would invest in that, you know, when you look up in the SEC's Edgar database, you know, what are the funds and who are, and how much money has each fund raised? You usually see a lawyer who represents the fund listed on there. You know, those investors are coming in looking for OZ tax benefits. They're going to be 10, 20, 30% of a deal. And 90% of the time, there's going to be a mortgage provider who could be a bank. You know, so you can look up. This is a CRS report on commercial real estate, right? These are regulated. These are updated regularly, and here you go. Who has debt on commercial real estate? Banks and thrifts. These are agency backs. So these are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Mortgages, life insurance companies. Here's other commercial mortgages. So these are mortgages that are securitized, not through Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. They're made. They talked about down here, right? They're called Conduit Loans. So they're companies. A lot of them are shadow banks. You know, if you've done coverage of the shadow banking sector. It's about $52 trillion now. So a lot of these are commercial real estate loans, right? They're not filtered through the CRA. They're just sort of they're making the loans, and
houses.
Yeah. And in my world, in addition to like coronavirus slowing down a lot of community development, or development that at least has some kind of public involvement that allows for some transparency and reporting. They're also paused,
okay.
but the everyone else in the commercial real estate world is sort of waiting to like pounce on the turmoil. As more loans start to default because stores, retailers, also residential tenants, hotels, as they start to default because they're not making the money they're not making their rent payments. Those loans and those assets are going to come up for sale, and who is standing ready with $142 billion in dry powder? It's the Blackstones and the Lone Stars of the world who are ready. And how are they going to do it?
No.
They're not. Some of them, they may buy properties outright. They may buy the loans on a lot of these properties. So this was last week. This is Freddie Mac this is a $534 million non-performing loan sale that Freddie Mac is doing. Who's going to buy these loans? Well, you can actually look up Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, and HUD have been doing this since the last financial crisis. They've been selling non-performing loan sales. These are loans that are on the verge of foreclosure. You can sort of see what's happened to them over time. You can also see where they are. So scroll back up here. This is both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in this report from the Federal Housing Finance Agency. So you can see where they are. You can see what's happened to them so far. If the foreclosure has been avoided, that's usually through some kind of loan modification. So this is the crazy thing about these loans. If you have a loan on a house, a mortgage that's a $200,000 mortgage on a house that's worth maybe $150,000, you can buy that loan maybe for $5,000 or $10,000. You can buy that loan, and you can write down the mortgage from $200,000 to whatever the home is actually worth, and you'll still make all the rest of the principal and interest on that loan that you bought from Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. So that tends to be what happens when you avoid the foreclosure. But then of course they're foreclosed, and as you can also see, like a good bit, about a third of these are vacant already. The owners walked away. The average NPL, the average time one of these loans has been delinquent is like something like 4 years. So a lot of these loans are just, sometimes they can't foreclose because the Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac don't want to have to take on the liability of losing that asset. They want to make some money off of this thing somehow. They don't want to lose their money. So that's why they'd rather sell it. They'd rather sell the loan and let someone else deal with the foreclosure or turn it into a rental property, which is what's happened. This is how groups like Invitation Homes, which was originally started by Blackstone, became a major single-family landlord. You can also see in these reports who's bought these loans. So this is almost, to me, I bring this up in part because this kind of gives me a sense of what might be happening in the opportunity zone market, because here you have Goldman Sachs buying a lot of these loans. Here's Lone Star that's bought a lot of these loans. Here's Angelo Gordon, it's a private equity group here, buying a lot of these loans. And then way down in here, let me see where it went.
So Oscar, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we actually running low on time.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Where did it go? Well, I think it's in here. Oh yes, here it is. Community loan. I'm already on it. Community Loan from New Jersey is a nonprofit that's actually bought. They bought 1,100 of these loans from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They bought another 1,100 from HUD, and they've been able to, if they haven't preserved the home ownership, they've been able to convert those homes into affordable housing, because that's a nonprofit that's done that. And I'm writing a story about them now, but I pointed out to just say, like, this could also be what's happening in the opportunity zone market. Is like, it's mostly this, and then there's like a couple examples like this one of your like mission driven organization that's been able to get a slice of this. It reminds me of what might be happening in the opportunity zone market today. So anyway, that's what I have for you guys.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Oscar. This was very, very informative. So we have a few more questions for questions and answers, but before we take questions, I want to acknowledge two people who are listening to today's webinar. Noah Buhajar, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing the last name wrong, from Bloomberg, and Sophie Quinton from Stateline. They both have written really wonderful and very informative articles on opportunities. So just wanted to acknowledge they're here with us today. So are there any questions? Please unmute yourself or type in the chat box.
Yeah, Kasia, did you see the question in the chat?
Yes, there is a
Annalise.
question. Yes. Could you elaborate on opportunity zone funds not working well with CDFIs, Community Development Finance Institutions?
So the issue with that is that CDFIs provide low interest loans to small businesses in the areas they serve, but then opportunity zones are equity based. So it's the fund actually taking ownership of something and then having to double its basis or the value of its investment in that thing over a period of months. And so small businesses that are existing already are reluctant to give up their ownership to these unknown investors in this fund. Whereas with a CDFI, they're just providing a low interest loan. And then proponents will say, like Dan Kowalski has said, in this time when small businesses are taking on tons and tons of debt to stay alive, that it's maybe better to have equity, but in practice it seems like it's not really how it's working out. And then I can also send there's testimony from Jennifer Basiloff of OFN, which is a network of CDFIs or an association for CDFIs, and she got really into detail about how it's not working. This is pretty recent. I mean, not super recent. October, it's a year old almost, but it's not from the beginning. It's from when this was had been in place for a bit on why it's not working well. So sending that right now. Does that help answer?
If I may add one other thing to that, it's there's very few industries that OZ funds can't invest in, and one of them is the financial industry itself. You can't be primarily a financial services company. And so some CDFIs that would like to raise capital for themselves in order to make more low interest loans, they can't use OZ funds to do this either. And I know there's been some talk of trying to change that, but it's just been so drowned out by pandemic response.
I have a question, if you don't mind. This is for anyone on the panel. What happens if the administration remains the same? I mean, will the program just kind of keep going as forward? It seems like there would be more potential for changes to the program if the administration changes, or maybe not.
I would say I definitely would expect changes to the program if the administration changes. I think under a Trump administration, because there's so much bipartisan support for reporting requirements, that could happen, and there are multiple bills to do that. They just have to come to agreement on how much public disclosure of investor information. But there's been like tons of lobbying energy behind that for past year plus. But under a Biden administration, I would imagine not only more reporting requirements, or just reporting requirements, but things like getting rid of the bad tracks and putting in new ones, or providing assistance to localities, or Biden has some proposal about pairing funds with nonprofits and things like that to just try and reform it a little bit. There was a lot of talk about this last fall among lawmakers in the House too. So I think you could see that, because Democrats definitely are more, oriented towards changing it, whereas Republicans just want to delay deadlines right now.
Any other questions? So I actually have a quick question. So Novograd reported recently that about 3% of all opportunity funds go to opportunity zone investment go to funds that are for operating businesses or partially for operating businesses. I'm wondering if you could just explain significance of that, or maybe it's not significant to any of the panelists. So investing in small businesses versus real estate and commercial estate.
Well, as Lydia mentioned earlier, a lot of small businesses are reluctant to give up equity shares. I would also say most equity investors, or if you want to know what's an equity investor, you think of an angel investor or a venture capital fund. They're looking for a business to grow. They want to do 5x, 10x. Unicorn is 100x or whatever. I forget what the definition is, but they need businesses to really grow. And from an equity perspective, let me give you an example. If a really in Detroit, the average white-owned business earns around $1 million in revenue, $1.3 million in revenue a year. The average Black-owned business earns $32,000 in revenue a year. Those numbers are a little bit dated because they come from the 2012 survey of business owners, and the more recent survey isn't out yet. But you can see the disparity. I mean, in Houston, it's $1.5 million for a white-owned business, and $50-something thousand for a Black-owned business. In Philadelphia, the disparity is not as big, but it's $500,000, I think, for a white-owned business, and $60,000 for a Black-owned business. Businesses owned by people of color are much smaller, tend to be much smaller, and they're not on a massive growth path, which also makes opportunity zone investment, doesn't work for a business that's not on a massive growth path. It doesn't mean there aren't businesses owned by people of color and women that aren't on a massive growth path. I mean, there are some. It's not for lack of talent. It's for lack of market, for lack of other reasons. But it just makes that segment of the market even worse, even less of an attraction to investors who are going to be using opportunity zones as a tax incentive.
Can I just quick add? I think it's important to point out that I think the creators of this policy envisioned it as, not just for real estate plays that were likely to happen anyway, but as a sort of springboard for entrepreneurial startups and business growth and helping existing businesses in these in areas that were left behind. And so what you'll hear from proponents is they keep saying with time, now that the regs are out, this imbalance between real estate and operating businesses is going to flatten out, but that's just clearly not happening if you saw the latest numbers from Novograd. And it makes sense because it's location based, so there are restrictions on how much activity you can have, and income you can have outside of the zone. So you need something that is just in one place. And yeah, the doubling your basis, the value of your investment in it, that's easier when you're just buying a property and effectively flipping it than it is with an operating business, because it's a little bit harder to measure how much you're doubling the value of your investment. So things like that in the rules and in the law itself, just make the real estate play more obvious. And then you couple that with the need for a high return, and that's why people worry about this luxury real estate potentially displacing people as a result of this.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I just really want to quickly show you our resource opportunities, our resource center. It's a good first step page to look for information. So this is our homepage, goodjobsfirst.org. It's on our main page, middle of our main page, or you can go to goodjobsfirst.org/OZ. This is a page where we have gathered a lot of links to different reports, rules and regulations, reform bills, websites, such as Gradic and Urban Institute have collected data on opportunity zones and have analyzed the data. We have also links on the bottom of this page to examples of very good journalism on opportunity zones, so you can, read those articles. They will inspire you to write your own stories about opportunity zones. So again, it's goodjobsfirst.org/opportunity zone. And if you're not on our opportunity zone listserv yet, please email me, Kasia, Kasia, @goodjobsfirst.org. So if there's no more questions, I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists, and I hope we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we have a training coming up, right, Kasia, at 2:15?
Yes, we have a training coming from Phil.
All right. Well, bye. Thanks for coming, Annalise and Caitlin.
Thank you so much.
Sophie.
That was really informative. Thanks.
Right. Sophie, that was a great story. The Pew story that you did in June.
Yes. Yes.
Are you still doing writing on opportunity zones, Sophie, or covering them or tracking them? She might be away from her desk. Phil, are you doing violation tracker today?
Yeah, that's what you put on the schedule.
Okay.
I mean, do you want to change it?
No, I think that's a good one.
He's clicking his heels and saluting and showing up. That was a great panel, Kasia.
Was.
Yeah. High protein, very high protein. And I thought it was terrific that Sophie and Noah joined us.
Yes.
And perhaps some of those other people whose names we don't know, but I captured them on a screenshot for you. I have written too. I didn't recognize some of those names, but good company.
Yeah, so I don't know if Sophie can hear us, but I want to echo what Irene just said, that Sophie, your last article about equity aspect of opportunity was very, very great. I really, well, she's gone.
She's gone.
So I hope she heard that.
Too much praise. Yeah, too modest.
And Greg, Caitlin is one of our fellows.
Oh, so, that's right. I recognize that name. There you go. Welcome, Caitlin.
She's also a
Sorry?
She's a past Ravitch fellow.
Oh.
Sorry, I had to figure out how to take my little thing off. Sorry, I've been so quiet. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
That was really cool.
Hi.
Good. Glad you like it.
Great.
Yeah.
We
It
like
seems like such a like unwieldy thing to get at, but I feel like if you just kind of like maybe tackled it like one site at a time, you could maybe pull together something. And maybe you don't even need to, do like, is that we used to have a reporter here, and why I've kind of like waited to do something on it was that there was a reporter at our paper who did like such a comprehensive thing, like when they had first kind of came out, that it was like, wow, how do you even top that much work? I mean, he was just like dedicated to doing projects.
What market was this?
The Bangor Daily News, so in the Maine area.
Sure.
But I feel like if you wanted to look at it, you could probably just kind of look at like, what was the worst like economic track, and if there's been any development there, and kind of, build out sort of thing. So.
No, I thought Eric's suggestion about looking at zones that have gotten no investment makes a lot of sense. We've always said that a lot of the rural zones, especially, you can't defy gravity. You can't swim against more than a century of rural depopulation. Right. A lot of those zones are just doomed. I think it was nice that governors made gestures, but I don't think they're going to really, like I say, defy gravity. So.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see how the pandemic affects. I think we kind of maybe talked about it a little bit, but I'll be curious to see how the pandemic kind of affects that, because you're seeing in Maine, you're seeing like a lot of people moving from other like, more dense states, and, they're buying up all the real estate out here, which is to the chagrin of a lot of people, because rent is relatively cheap, I would say, in Maine compared to other parts of the Northeast. But, if you have all these people from New York who are buying up the homes and, they're bringing like theoretically like they're good remote jobs here. So I'll be really curious to see if they stick around and whether that will turn into anything. But you're right, you see places like, I think I was looking at that map and it was showing like Lewiston, Auburn area, which is like one of the poorest and like most populated parts of the state. And like, I just know for a fact that there's no economic they'd like there to be, but if there is any opportunity zone work out there, I'd be shocked.
Give it back to Arlene here to introduce Phil. I just agree with you. We had one of our former staff people was trying to retire and buy a home with his wife in Brunswick or Bath, and he couldn't find anything. He ended up in Gardner, and I spent a big chunk of my summer up there at Grandma's because of the pandemic, because there's no camp for kids. But we should take it away with Violation Tracker.
All right. Well, thanks for coming and being here. Phil Matera is our research director, and Violation Tracker is our most visited database. So Phil's going to take a few minutes to just sort of highlight some of the features. Thanks, Phil.
Hey, thank you, Arlene. So I will share my